This video is a part of Project Middle East, a multi-channel collaboration tackling topics of Middle Eastern history. There's a link for the entire playlist for the project linked in the description, and I hope you check out every video in it. When it comes to historical rivals, one of the all-time biggest ones were Rome and Persia. The rivalry between Rome and Persia was long enough to last through multiple dynasties of their respective histories. What started as a sort of Cold War-style rivalry based on who might control the Middle Eastern border states between them would escalate into multiple wars. The Battle of Carrhae in 63 BC was the first major encounter in battle and resulted in a major Roman defeat at the hands of the Parthian Persians, where they lost 20,000 men in battle and another 10,000 or so were captured. From then on, Persia was a top enemy. Over the course of 3 centuries, Rome and Persia would continually fight in multiple wars. However, in the mid-3rd century AD, the Parthians were overthrown by the Sassanids, or Sassanians. And this would result in quite a shift in Persian foreign policy, so to speak. While the Parthians did enjoy empire building, their strategy was often employing a lot of client and vassal states in the hopes of having a sort of patriarchal control over the Middle East and its trade to ensure they'd remain rich and powerful. However, the Sassanids who overthrew the Parthians wanted to restore the glory of the original Achaemenid Persian Empire, like under Cyrus the Great. They weren't going to be satisfied with corralling dozens of vassals, but rather wanted it all, and as a result would be more aggressive. Eventually, Rome would famously split west and east permanently in 395. The eastern half, while considering themselves Roman, is what we also consider the Byzantine Empire. Historians use that label because onwards from that split, the empire focused around Greek and Constantinople more than Latin and Rome. And especially once the western half and Rome itself fell, that fate was sealed. But with the west being lost and Rome itself no longer the center of the Roman world, Persia was no longer a distant frontier rival, but now a much closer threat geopolitically speaking. After the year 395, there would be 7 wars between the Byzantines and Persians, and this video will briefly go over all of them, tallying up their rivalry and discussing their impact. This war was the first one where the Sassanids fought the now separated Eastern Roman Empire, and it was a religious war. A group of Christians had attacked some Zoroastrian temples, which prompted the Sassanid ruler Bahram V to persecute Christians. The Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II used this as an excuse and invaded. This was a simple back and forth where the Romans tried to besiege the fortress of Nisibis, but had abandoned it because the Huns invaded on their northern frontier. The Sassanids took advantage of this to besiege the city of Theodosiopolis for about a month, but then they gave up. A peace treaty was signed in 422, and no changes to the border occurred, although they both pledged to guarantee a liberty of religion in their territories. So, a draw. This was even shorter than the previous one. Basically, Rome had been paying the Sassanids 500 pounds of gold annually based on a different agreement all the way back from 387. But Theodosius II decided to stop paying that, which led to the Sassanids declaring war. But before the war could even escalate to anything past border skirmishes, the Vandals were causing trouble out west, and the Eastern Romans needed to help their Western brethren, so they made a quick peace treaty where they agreed to resume payments and to stop building more forts in Mesopotamia. So basically the Sassanids won by default here. Ah, a war with an actual name. That's nice for a change. This one was fought between 502 and 506 after the fall of Western Rome, but before the Eastern Romans would attempt to reconquer the West. The Sassanids were low on money and in debt to the Hephthalites, and decided to get money from Rome by force. The Persians led an effective offensive, and the Roman counteroffensive under Emperor Anastasius failed to stop them. The Sassanid Emperor Kavad reached Edessa and demanded 10,000 pounds of gold for peace, but the Byzantines refused, and a second counteroffensive pushed him back. But before the Byzantines could completely turn the tide, the Huns, which had been retreating further east since the death of Attila from 50 years back, raided through the Caucasian mountains, and this prompted the two parties to work on a peace treaty. And in 506, the Byzantines agreed to pay 1,000 pounds of gold to the Sassanids, but keep the borders at status quo antebellum. So I guess this is technically another Sassanid victory, even if it's not as far of a victory as they may have wanted. This war broke out in 526, but despite the name, this is not about the Iberian Peninsula where modern-day Spain and Portugal are at. Rather, this is about the Georgian kingdom of Iberia in the Caucasian mountains. This cause of the war was a mixture of tensions between the two empires that ultimately was set off when Iberia decided to switch from being a Sassanid vassal to a Byzantine one. It also didn't help that the Byzantines lent ships to the Kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia to help them conquer the Himyarites in modern-day Yemen, which were also a Sassanid vassal. Notably, the Byzantine Emperor Justin I died a year into this conflict and was succeeded by Justinian the Great. However, the Sassanids were ultimately able to inflict several defeats, notably at the Battle of Callinicum in modern-day Syria. Ultimately, the Persians won, with the Byzantines paying 11,000 pounds of gold, with Iberia going back to Sassanid control. However, the Byzantines got a consolation prize of being able to have the Kingdom of Lazic as their vassal. The peace treaty was supposed to be one of perpetual peace, but of course, peace would not last forever. So that eternal peace thing didn't even last a decade, as in 541 the Lazicans rebelled against Byzantine control, and the Persians decided to join in and help them. In 545 there's a peace treaty affirming Sassanid control, but then eventually the Lazicans didn't like the Persians either, and asked the Byzantines for help in 548. They drove the Persians out, but never quite decisively defeated them, so eventually an agreement was made where the Persians would recognize Lazic as a Byzantine vassal if they paid them even more gold. In 562, they signed a 50-year peace treaty, which I suppose is more plausible than an eternal peace treaty, but obviously it still wouldn't live up to this name. Another, technically, Sassanid victory, I guess? So 10 years into the 50-year peace treaty, war broke out over control over Caucasian state vassals once again. At first, the Persians were winning quite handily, especially in Mesopotamia, where they captured the Byzantine fortress of Dara, which reportedly made the Byzantine Emperor Justin II go insane, to where the control of the empire was passed to his wife. But after a short truce, the Byzantines started to beat the Persians back to a stalemate. But what ended up tipping the balance was a civil war in Sassanid Persia in 589. One of the contestants, Khosrow II, convinced the Byzantines to join forces with his army to give him the throne in exchange for a favorable end to the war. This worked, and in 591, Khosrow II was now the Sassanid emperor, and in gratitude ended the war by giving the Byzantines a considerable chunk of Armenia. So, hey, congrats Byzantines, you finally won one. You may have noticed that this is the first war where there was a considerable exchange of territory rather than just a vassal and a bunch of gold. The frontier had moved considerably, yet this would pale in comparison to the next and final war. So Khosrow II was still in charge of the Sassanid Persians, and in theory on friendly terms with the Byzantines. However, remember that whole thing about how the Sassanids wanted to restore the glory of Persia? Well, oh boy does Khosrow get his chance here. Byzantine Empire Maurice in 602 was murdered by a rival named Phocas. This caused the Byzantine governor in Mesopotamia to rebel against him. He called for the Sassanids to help, and they certainly did by seizing control of the province. The now Byzantine Emperor Phocas, upon eventually capturing this governor, burned him alive, but nevertheless, war began. In 608, another rebellion occurred in Byzantine North Africa, and while Persia did not conquer Tunisia, it still provided strain on the Byzantine war effort. The Sassanids used this to push further into Anatolia and Syria. Ironically enough, the perpetrator of the rebellion, Heraclius, ended up becoming the new Byzantine emperor in 610. But the Sassanids weren't stopping yet. In 614, the Sassanids managed to capture Jerusalem. During this, they captured a relic known as the True Cross. It was a relic that the Byzantines claimed was a chunk of wood that was supposedly a part of the cross that Jesus Christ himself was crucified on. So naturally, this was a huge blow to Byzantine morale. Then in 618, the Sassanids took control of Egypt. Shockingly, the Byzantines didn't give up, and in 622 they managed to win a decisive victory at a currently unknown location somewhere in Anatolia. The Sassanids, however, still had plenty of fight in them, and eventually in 626 decided to coordinate with the Avars in the Balkans to do a joint siege of Constantinople. Reports at the time claimed the Byzantines were outnumbered 10-1. Modern estimates claim it was closer to 6-1. Regardless, the walls of Constantinople held, and the Byzantines managed to drive the invaders back miraculously. The Byzantines then teamed up with the Gurk Turks to invade the Persian heartland and change the tide of the war. Khosrow II was captured by a rival Persian family and then murdered, which led to another Sassanid civil war. The Persians therefore had no choice but to accept peace, where status quo antebellum was restored in terms of borders, and they returned the True Cross relic. So yeah, while the Byzantines were heavily bruised, they definitely won this one. Okay, yeah, so the score, I suppose, is a little bit misleading. The Sassanids won more wars, but the wars they won were smaller in scale. The other thing to note is that in the long term, both sides would just lose in general. The final war exhausted both empires and left them weak, which was bad timing for the up-and-coming Arab invasions during the rise of Islam. Most historians agree that while the Arabs did have good generals and soldiers in their own right, the final Byzantine-Sassanid War weakening both nations helped the Arabs advance as far as they did into Anatolia and North Africa in the case of the Byzantines, and then outright fully conquering the Sassanid Persians in the 640s. So yeah, turns out fighting all the time has its consequences. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.